Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Donegan, and welcome to Radical Age Reversal. This is a show about keeping your longevity, which means you're going to stay healthy for as long as possible in your lifetime and not fall into age related diseases or metabolically driven diseases. None of those things that we want. Some things that come to mind can be anything from heart issues to cancers to autoimmune diseases and the like. And so let's get started. We are in the book Eat to Beat Your Diet. And today we're continuing on page 52. And the title of our show is All Fat Created Equal? And I'm going to go over three different things during the show. And I think these are all really important for us to understand how fat is created in the body. Now, if you remember in our last episode, we ended on how babies develop in utero and how fat plays a role in their development. So we're going to pick up now after birth, and we're going to take your body all the way through to adulthood and follow the fat. We're also going to talk about the obesity gene, which is called the FTO gene, that affects 67% of Americans. And we're going to talk about how fat can get out of control and compound in your body. But we have three really key essential oils that we're going to end with to show you how you can modulate that. So if we are looking and following together in the book, again, we're on page 52, just before the paragraph where it says differences in fat distribution. Now, remember, we said that in utero, fat is a really key component to the development and growth of a baby in utero. And once the baby is born, whether you're a boy or a girl, the way your fat develops is different. But I will share with you that that beautiful chubby baby that we all love when we see them and are attracted to is due in great part because of fat development in the body. And in fact, it says it turns out that by the age of 1, a baby's fat cells is 5 times larger than when they were born. So you can see that the healthy development of a human being really relies on the development of fat. So again, we're trying to get clear on what fat is and what it does and how we should feel about fat in our body. Now, remember, there are different types of fat, right? There's subcutaneous fat that surrounds our organs, that's very dangerous. There's also the adipose fat, which is the squishy fat that we all like, which actually sculpts your body. That's something we're going to talk about. And then there's brown fat. We learned a lot about brown fat last week and how important it is to our hormone production and our metabolism and our overall immune system and our health. So let's look at what happens from the age of 1 all the way through to our 60s and even into our 70s. So let's talk a little bit about the differences. I'm just going to read this paragraph because it's very succinct and I think it gives you the picture that you need. I don't want to just abbreviate it because all this information is pretty important. Studies have examined what happens to fat from infancy to adolescence and beyond. From age 2 to 5, kids start getting taller and lankier. The body fat declines in both boys and girls. Boys shed roughly 25% of their body fat, while girls only shed 20%. There's not much difference, which is why young girls and boys are shaped so similarly. It is in the years that follow during adolescence and adulthood that the differences in body fat become much more dramatic. So, remember, one of the reasons that we have fat is that it sculpts the body. A woman's body and a man's body is sculpted differently. We have different silhouettes. And so when you look at the physique of a human being, whether you see their face or not, you should be able to tell male or female because of body fat sculpting. Now, in obesity, we lose the natural sculpting that occurs in a healthy body. And although there are lots of different body types based on your genetics and your ancestry, all of that is true. There is defined differences that we can see between men and women. So men have a burst of fat in puberty. And sometimes you see this when with young boys when they hit puberty. They gain a lot of weight, like almost overnight. They go from being these super skinny kids to kind of being a little bit overweight. In girls, it's a steady weight gain. All right. So with boys, you get like this burst of fat and then it tapers off. With girls, it's like this uphill climb. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, I just keep gaining weight and gaining weight. Or you see this in a adolescent. And there's a lot of like body shaming, there's a lot of body dysmorphia, and there's a desire in young women to look older, right? Because they don't want those body changes to be happening. They want to be at the end goal, right? So they see women in their 20s and their 30s that are beautifully sculpted. And as they're in puberty, they see that their bodies are kind of going through this change and it's awkward and it's uncomfortable and it's surprising. And, where is this all coming from? So it's important for us as older women and men to walk with our adolescent girls and boys, and so that we can help them through the development process so that they learn to love their bodies at every stage, that they understand what's happening and why fat can be really good. Because I feel like our society has vilified fat, or they've ignored it, right? There's this sense of we don't want to fat shame people, which of course you don't want to shame anyone for any reason. And we're going to talk about why certain people end up obese and what can be done about it. But I think it's also important to drive home the importance of a good lifestyle so that your body develops in the most healthy way possible. And that if you are not on a healthy path, you have to be able to have a conversation with a young person, especially because it's easier for them to change than it is as we get older and the damage isn't done yet, right? It's important for us to help them get back on that path of health. So, really key things for us to keep in mind. So, what happens next is that we are going to focus on an adolescent torso. So something starts to happen in women that doesn't happen in men, is they start to lose 17% of the fat around the torso. So remember, puberty is all about body sculpting. All right. And so with women, you're going to start to see that hourglass shape being carved, whereas a man's torso is much more rectangular. It's going to be much more even from the shoulders to the waist, more like a triangle, right? So you have maybe the broader shoulders and a narrower waist. But with women, you have a more hourglass figure. So believe it or not, women have 48% less waist fat. So not waste as in garbage, waist as in the section right above your hips. So on the other hand, women have more fat on their hips than men. And this is not necessarily due to weight gain. This is due to fat sculpting for a particular reason. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with bone hip ratio. So you can have a larger pelvis, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a greater amount of hip fat. The two are not correlated or related whatsoever. Now, something that we have to help women understand as they're developing is that girls start in early puberty with 16% more hip fat. But then as they progress, they end up with 47% more hip fat by the time they're adults, and then 66% more later in life, right? So women are always going to have this steady progression of fat accumulation around the hips, and that's just part of natural development. Now, as long as that weight gain is in a healthy range, it's actually a good thing. So just we have to embrace as women, I think, the curves around our hips, and we have to embrace the differences between a man's fat sculpting and a woman's fat sculpting. Okay, so let's talk about visceral fat. Now, remember, visceral fat is the fat that's subcutaneous, it's found around the organs, and is known to be more dangerous than adipose fat, which is the squishy fat. Here's where men are at a strong disadvantage. Men have 50% more visceral fat. So that fat that's hidden in men is much greater than women. So we have to be very good at helping men understand that they should be tracking the amount of visceral fat that they have. And I was really surprised recently. A friend of mine posted his numbers because he was doing sort of an overall body study. And when I saw his visceral fat number was so much higher than mine, and yet I feel like he's a very slim person, it was surprising to me because it really does drive home this idea that you can be skinny fat, right? That you can have that fat that is unseen but can cause a lot of damage because it's so close to your organs. So that's something that I think we all need to keep in mind, right? The amount of fat that we have, where it is, and what it is critically important to our health outcomes. Now, when we move further along in life between our 40s and our 60s, women are going to gain even more fat. They gain about a half of a large soda bottle's worth of visceral fat. Now, that's the type of fat that we don't want, right? That's the fat that we see more in men. But as we age, the danger of increasing that fat is going to go higher. So it's even more important that we focus on lifestyle. Actually, it's always important that we focus on lifestyle. And look, if you start a good habit as a young person and you can train yourself well through puberty and you can train yourself well through adulthood and then other changes into later phases of life, right? Those wisdom phases. It's really important, and those habits will carry you through, and you don't have to worry about all the numbers and making sure you're on a good path, because your habits will guide you in the right direction. So here's something that shocked me. Ready? Hormonal changes of menopause, contrary to popular thinking, do not automatically lead to more body fat. And that was shocking to me because you hear this from women all the time, right? I went into menopause, I gained weight around my thighs, I gained weight around my hips. And what they're discovering through these studies is actually there isn't necessarily a correlation or a causation between menopause and certain weight gain, that it's really more related to lifestyle than it is related to menopause or time of life. Now, um, in adulthood, men have 20 to 30% less fat than women. After age 50, male subcutaneous fat accumulation is dramatically slowed down, which I thought was interesting. Healthy women always have more subcutaneous fat than healthy men, and men always have more visceral fat, the harmful stuff, than women. Okay, so the squishy fat, more on women. The hidden fat that's super dangerous, that leads to those diseases that we have to be very careful about, more prevalent in older men. So we have to really focus on our older men and getting them healthy. It's very, very important. Now, let's go to the good fat. The good fat is the brown fat. And I thought this was really, really interesting. So here's a fact. Number one, your good fat, that brown fat, only accounts for 1.5 to 4% of your total fat mass. So this is actually very small. And originally, they thought that it was going to be in forms of lumps, but and because I see this in certain animals, but in humans it's different. Okay, so even though we are created, we are a creature. We're not animals, and the human body is drastically different than what we see in a lot of animals. And so one of the differences is that our brown fat comes in these thin wafer sheets, and those thin wafer sheets are going to lay very close to our muscles and our bones, especially, now this is interesting to me, the collarbone, the neck, and the armpits. So you're also going to see it on the spine, behind the breastbone, and inside the abdomen. The greatest proportion, about 16%, 66% of brown fat was around the neck, the collarbone, and armpit regions. And these locations were responsible for 70% of the total brown fat activity. And we know brown fat activity is excellent, right? It regulates our metabolism, it keeps us young, it keeps us disease free, right? We know this is a very important aspect of our physiology. So let's take a look at how fat goes from friend to foe. And as I said before, we're going to talk now about the fat gene. What is the fat gene? I did my genetic study recently. I guess it was about 2 years ago when doTERRA launched their metabolic program called MetaPower. And I really wanted to, I thought I had gone through menopause and gained weight. I didn't understand what was happening. It was just that I needed some lifestyle changes. And when I added MetaPower, I was able to drop 22 pounds and also kind of redefined and resculpt my body. I was also able to see like the percentages of fat to carbs to proteins that I should be eating right now in my life. I really feel like it's important for everyone to understand if they have certain genetic mutations. Now, the fat gene, the FTO gene, was created by nature through evolution to keep human beings alive during moments of starvation. So, if you have the FTO gene like I do, you can starve a lot better than someone else. And I will share with you, I started intermittent fasting about 2 years ago. And at the beginning, I was really, really hungry. And now I'm rarely hungry, if at all, when I fast. And I remember when I first started fasting, I wanted that hollow feeling. I wanted to feel like empty, like I was somehow in need of food, because that's how I would know that I was hungry. Because, of course, I haven't eaten for, 16 hours, and I used to be grazing for 16 hours. So, why wasn't I feeling hungry after a while? And when I realized was that the FTO gene, because it's helping me not eat, it allows my body to actually utilize my ketones more effectively. And it also raises my leptin levels. Remember, we talked about leaders act right last week? That leptin level increase, and oops, I am losing my power. So I'm going to plug in my computer. That allows you to be able to go longer periods without eating and allows your body to repair. So that's really, really important. So if you have the FTO gene, the good news is you can go longer periods without eating compared to someone else without it. The bad news is that there is a link between the FTO gene and cancer. But honestly, everything I've read, one of the things that I've seen is that people who allow the urges of the FTO gene to take over their lifestyle choices. And we're going to talk about what happens to people with this genetic mutation. Um, that unhealthy lifestyle, I think, is more related to cancer than the genetics itself. Okay. So, because we know that lifestyle can overcome the urges of this gene, I think it's important for us to realize we're not helpless and that we have ways of dealing with this, what is really should be thought of as a positive mutation. But under the abundance of the modern American lifestyle, it can actually turn into something negative if we just sort of go with that urge to eat things. So, what does that gene encourage us to do? It actually makes fried foods and sugary foods look more desirable. So, for people who have the gene, you may go out to a carnival and you want to drink all the sweet things. You want to eat the ice cream, you want to eat the candy, and you want to eat all that fried food that you see. Whereas somebody else may look at that and it actually turns their stomach and they're like, oh, I do not want that. So I'm not saying that that's a good test of whether or not you have the FTO gene. But if you have that gene, just beware those things are going to be much more desirable to you than someone without it. So knowledge is power. And once you know, then you can say to yourself, this isn't something that's healthy for me. I know that. And I'm not going to indulge in those things because they're not going to be good for you. They're going to be very, very harmful. The other thing is there are 4 or 5 um, situations or environmental factors that feed into overeating. And I think most of us know them, but I think it's important for us to review them. So one is called hedonistic eating, which is basically you're just eating for pleasure. You're not eating because you're hungry. You're not eating because you need food. You're not eating because you need nutrition. You're literally eating for pleasure. The next one is distracted eating. And so this is highly, highly recommended to not do. So what's the thing that we do when we go to the movies? The first thing we see is that counter where we can get soda and candy and popcorn, right? So sweet and salty things. And we sit there in a movie focused on the movie, right? So we're not focused on the popcorn. In fact, it's really dark in the theater. And so are you really looking at the food? No. Are you really looking at the drink? No. I've seen people in a movie literally like their eyes are glued to the screen and they're eating and they're drinking, and it's like a very passive activity. That's not the way eating was designed in your body. Eating is meant to be a very interactive, social, engaging activity. And so if you are putting yourself in an environment where you're not engaged with your food, you're engaged with something else, you're losing out on the natural regulatory and health benefits of actually being engaged with your food. I've even heard people say you shouldn't be reading a book while you're eating. And although that's probably true, I think that social eating is important too. So if you're with a friend and you're eating and you're talking, to me, that sounds like it's as distracting as if you're alone and you're eating and you're reading a book. But I could be wrong. Put it in the comment section. Like, what do you think about that? Are they the same thing? But one thing I know to be really important is when you are eating, do as much preparation as you can. Like cook your food, cut your food, take out all the shortcuts if you can. I know we put all the shortcuts in, and now people are telling you to take the shortcuts out, but it does make a difference. So you want to take those shortcuts out so that you can engage with your food as long as possible. The other thing you can do if you have the FTO gene is to always go with fiber first. So one of the things we know with people with the FTO gene is their gut microbiome might not be flourishing the way it needs to, and that leptin may not be as sensitive. So feeding good gut microbiome things like PB Restore from doTERRA, like fiber from doTERRA, eating fiber rich fuels. I recommend a book called Fiber Fueled. Wonderful book. Take a look at it. Fiber, fiber, fiber. So important. And it's everywhere in the world of natural foods. So there's lots of good foods that you can eat that bring fiber into your life. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, of course, the danger zone. The danger zone is, unfortunately, the more fat you have, the more fat you produce. Okay. So that was a little disheartening to me when I read it. It was like, oh my gosh. So it's like compound interest, right? Like you never want to take out a compound interest loan. You want to take out a simple interest loan, because the problem with compound interest is you never really catch up because it compounds, right? The interest is added to the principal, and then the interest is put on both the principal and that interest, and it just compounds and compounds and compounds. And if you're actually receiving that interest, then you're making tons of money and everything is good for you. But if you're paying that money, you feel like you can never catch up, which is also what happens with people when they become obese. The fat produces more fat and it goes absolutely haywire. And it doesn't have enough oxygen, and it doesn't have enough blood supply. And so it starts to go crazy and it starts to freak out and create all kinds of inflammation because it does not want to die. Fat does not want to die because at its core, it is a life giving resource for your body, but uncontrolled, it will blossom into something crazy and you can't control it. And that's where the compounding comes in. So I just wanted to go over a couple of things, including don't eat too quickly, right? Like slow it down. The slower you eat, the better you're going to be. Um, And if you eat too quickly, if you eat under stress, if you eat just for pleasure, if you eat distractedly, you're going to feed into something, no pun intended, that's going to allow that fat to exponentially grow. And we don't want that to compound. So, what is the result of that? Malfunctioning hormones, widely released cytokines, hypoxia, which is that panic that happens without enough oxygen and blood, and inflammation. And this wreaks havoc on your health. Now, I never want to end on a down note, and we're on page 60, by the way. So I'm going to give you three essential oils that are going to help with three different aspects of compounding fat. Okay, the first one is desire, right? Remember, we talked about the desire for the fatty food, the desire for the sweet food. And so, what you have to say is, I don't want the chocolate cake. My FTO gene wants the chocolate cake. And I am going to turn off my FTO gene by using clove oil. Now, the most effective way to do this is to actually take the bottle like this, put it on your finger, and touch it to your tongue. Okay. That clove will get into the interstitial tissues of your mouth. It's going to be really spicy, by the way. It is strong. You're gonna have fresh breath all day long. Okay, but if you give this a moment, it's going to actually turn off that desire, and you're not gonna want to eat the thing, right? You're not gonna want to eat the thing. The second way, which is nearly as effective, but not always, and I would do this by putting it on I don't have one right now, but I would recommend doing this on a tissue, because having a lot of clove on your hand, if you rub your eye, it can really burn. And so you have to make sure that you get the clove off of your hands. So putting it on a tissue or putting on a cloth is going to be really good. But the idea, and I'm just going to do this by smelling it from the bottle, is just to breathe it in as much as possible until you feel a brain shift, right? And then you're going to look at that food and say, I don't really want that. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is cassia. Now, cassia is important because it's one of the essential oils that turns on GLP-1 and turns off that FTO desire. And so this one also, I would not touch this with my hands. It's very hot. These oils are really hot, all three of them that I'm going to talk about. But what you can do is tip it back and put a drop on your tongue. Now, as you can see, I didn't even put this on my finger. I think this is way, way too hot. It'll make your lips tingle, and nothing bad is happening. You could put this in a little bit of coconut oil, or you could put this in a little bit of olive oil, which would be really, really good. But taking this internally is going to help to turn on GLP-1, which is going to regulate, right, how much you're going to want to eat. So that's another tip. Now, the third one is we're going to talk about insulin response. Okay. So if we're going to be eating and overeating and eating too fast, all right, if that's something that you struggle with, then you're going to go with cinnamon. This one's not actually, ironically, not as hot as the other ones. And I just put a drop right on my tongue before I eat. Now, I do recommend the doTERRA Assist, which has berberine in it, which is also going to turn on GLP-1. These in combination are amazing. Of course, the MetaPower blend also has cinnamon, but I really wanted to take a moment to highlight these three oils. Okay, just once again, clove oil, which is going to kill your appetite for things that you shouldn't be eating. Cassia, which is going to help regulate the way your body feels full. Like, am I eating enough? Did I eat enough? You know, that it's going to really encourage your leptin response. And then cinnamon bark, which is going to work with your insulin balance so that you can become more insulin sensitive. All right, I hope these tips have been helpful. We're going to start back next week on page 60 in the middle if you want to go ahead and read ahead. But for now, I am just going to say, here's to breaking the limits of age. and living each day with vitality. Keep thriving, and I will see you all in the next episode of Radical Age Reversal. And the links to these oils will be in the show notes. Thanks for joining me.